long before the Bible became one of the most influential spiritual texts in human history, long before the rise of Israelite kingdoms, and even long before the birth of Christianity, the African continent was already home to some of the most complex and deeply structured spiritual systems the world had ever known. Systems that were not based on superstition or primitive imagination as many later narratives would claim, but instead were sophisticated cosmologies built around order, balance, divine hierarchy, sacred laws, ritual communication, and an understanding that the spiritual world and the human world were inseparably connected through ancestry, covenant, and sacred responsibility. Across vast regions of Africa, from the ancient Nile Valley civilizations of Kemet and Nubia to the spiritual traditions of West African cultures like the Yoruba, Akan, and Dogon, people believed in a layered spiritual universe where a supreme creator existed at the highest level, often distant yet all-powerful, while beneath that supreme creator existed powerful spiritual intermediaries who controlled natural forces such as thunder, fire, water, iron, fertility, and the movement of celestial bodies, and these beings were not viewed as rivals to the creator, but as extensions of divine order, guardians of cosmic balance, and protectors of humanity's relationship with the unseen world. What becomes fascinating is that when we examine the Bible carefully, especially through historical and comparative cultural study, we begin to notice that a remarkably similar structure appears inside the biblical text itself, where a supreme God exists at the top of divine authority while beneath him appears a council of spiritual beings, messengers, watchers, and angels who carry out divine commands, enforce moral laws, and influence the natural world, suggesting that rather than existing in isolation, biblical theology may have developed within a broader ancient spiritual environment that included African and Near Eastern religious frameworks that shared striking structural similarities. Ancient African spiritual traditions often describe divine assemblies or councils where spiritual beings gathered to discuss cosmic balance, human destiny, and the enforcement of moral order. And this concept echoes passages found inside the Hebrew Bible, particularly in texts like Psalm 82 and the Book of Job, where God is described as standing within a divine council surrounded by other heavenly beings, a detail that has puzzled scholars and theologians for centuries because it presents a spiritual hierarchy that feels more complex than simple monotheism. In African cosmology, divine beings associated with thunder were often responsible for justice and judgment. Fire-related deities symbolized transformation and purification. Water spirits represented healing, fertility, and emotional balance, and iron or metal deities symbolized technology, warfare, protection, and human advancement. And when biblical narratives describe angels controlling storms, pillars of divine fire leading nations through deserts, heavenly beings controlling rivers, or celestial messengers wielding swords of judgment, the functional roles appear almost identical, though the identities and names have been transformed. This transformation did not necessarily eliminate the older spiritual meanings, but instead reshaped them into a new theological language that fit within the rising religious structure of biblical monotheism, a process that historians often describe as spiritual adaptation rather than simple replacement. When Christianity began expanding across Africa during the early centuries of the Common Era and later during the period of European colonization, it encountered societies that already possessed strong spiritual identities and deeply rooted cosmological understandings, and history has shown repeatedly that belief systems rarely disappear instantly because they are woven into language, culture, ritual, and social identity, which meant that missionaries and religious institutions faced a complex challenge. If they completely rejected African spiritual frameworks, they risked alienating entire populations. But if they absorbed certain symbolic structures and reinterpreted them through biblical language, they could create a smoother path toward religious conversion. Over time, spiritual beings that were once worshipped as divine intermediaries began appearing in Christian narratives as angels, demons, or symbolic metaphors representing moral forces, allowing communities to retain familiar spiritual ideas while gradually shifting their religious allegiance toward biblical theology. This process of reinterpretation was subtle and often invisible to the populations experiencing it because familiar spiritual patterns remained present, though their authority and identity had changed under a new religious framework. As colonial expansion intensified between the 15th and 19th centuries, the spiritual reinterpretation process took on a more aggressive tone, shifting from adaptation toward demonization. where African deities and spiritual practices were increasingly portrayed as evil, dangerous, or forbidden, and spiritual leaders who once held respected roles as healers, diviners, and guardians of ancestral knowledge were often labeled witches, sorcerers, or agents of dark forces, a transformation that served not only religious purposes but also political and cultural ones. By redefining traditional African spiritual systems as demonic or primitive, colonial authorities created justification for suppressing indigenous knowledge, dismantling sacred traditions, and replacing cultural identity with European religious and social structures, turning theology into a tool of governance and cultural control. This rewriting of spiritual history allowed colonial institutions to present Christianity as the only legitimate spiritual authority while portraying African cosmologies as corrupted distortions of divine truth. Despite the fact that many of the symbolic structures and spiritual concepts continued to survive within local Christian practices, hymns, rituals, and folklore, quietly preserving fragments of older traditions beneath the surface of newly adopted religious identities. Understanding this historical and spiritual layering does not require rejecting the Bible or abandoning faith, because religious texts often evolve through centuries of cultural exchange, translation, and reinterpretation, and recognizing these influences can actually deepen spiritual understanding by revealing how faith traditions grow, adapt, and survive across different civilizations and historical periods. The Bible itself is not a single document written in isolation but a collection of texts compiled over centuries, shaped by migrations, empires, political reforms, linguistic translations, and encounters with neighboring cultures, which means that traces of older spiritual frameworks, including African influences, can exist within its narrative without invalidating its theological significance. Instead, acknowledging these layers allows believers and scholars alike to appreciate the complexity of spiritual history and recognize that truth is rarely fragile, and that divine understanding often expands rather than contracts when examined through historical context. Today, as global scholarship continues exploring ancient manuscripts, oral traditions, archaeology, and comparative religious studies, new conversations are emerging about how interconnected ancient civilizations truly were, revealing that Africa played a central role not only in human biological origins, but also in shaping early spiritual philosophies that influenced neighboring regions, including the societies that later produced biblical literature. Recognizing Africa's contribution to spiritual history does not divide religious identity but enriches it, allowing modern audiences to understand that faith traditions are living histories shaped by countless generations seeking meaning, morality, and connection with the divine. The story of how African spiritual frameworks may have been rewritten inside biblical narratives reminds us that history is not always erased through destruction but often survives through transformation, adaptation, and reinterpretation, waiting for future generations to rediscover the connections hidden beneath layers of translation, theology, and cultural change. And as we continue exploring these hidden intersections between ancient Africa and biblical tradition, we are not rewriting history but uncovering the deeper story of how humanity has always searched for divine truth through different languages, different symbols, and different civilizations, yet often with remarkably similar visions of the sacred universe. Thank you for watching. Subscribe to The Biblical Origin for more hidden truths. Like and comment your thoughts, and keep exploring the layers of history with us.